The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Chen adjusted her ill-fitting uniform for the 100th time. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely weighing 100 pounds soaking wet, she looked more like a lost teenager than a soldier in the elite ranger training program. The fabric hung loose on her small frame, and her helmet constantly slipped down over her eyes despite multiple adjustments to the chin strap.
"Look what the recruitment office dragged in," sneered Corporal Jake Morrison, a towering mountain of muscle who had already earned the nickname Tank among their training group.
His voice carried across the assembly area, drawing snickers from the other recruits.
"Did someone's little sister get lost on her way to summer camp?"
Sarah kept her eyes forward, her jaw clenched tight as more laughter erupted around her.
This wasn't new.
Since arriving at Fort Braxton 3 weeks ago, she had endured constant ridicule from her fellow trainees. They called her paper soldier behind her back, sometimes even to her face, suggesting she would crumple at the first sign of real combat. The nickname had started during their first week when Drill Sergeant Rodriguez had paired them up for hand-to-hand combat training. Sarah had been matched against Tommy Brick Williams, a former college football linebacker who outweighed her by at least 80 pounds. The entire group had gathered around, expecting to watch her get demolished in seconds. Instead, something unexpected happened. As Brick charged forward with all the subtlety of a freight train, Sarah had simply stepped aside at the last possible moment, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the training mat.
The move was so fluid, so perfectly timed, that even Sergeant Rodriguez had raised an eyebrow.
But, instead of earning respect, the incident had only fueled more mockery. "Lucky shot," Tank had declared that day, and the sentiment had stuck. No matter what Sarah accomplished during training, her fellow recruits found ways to dismiss it. When she consistently scored perfect marks on the shooting range, they claimed the targets were rigged. When she completed obstacle courses in record time, they insisted the timers were broken. When she demonstrated superior tactical knowledge during strategy sessions, they suggested she had somehow cheated or memorized answers beforehand. The truth was far more complex than any of them could imagine.
Sarah's small stature and quiet demeanor masked a background that would have shocked her tormentors into silence.
But she kept those secrets locked away, hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed normalcy. Growing up in a military family had taught Sarah the value of discipline and preparation. Her father, Colonel Marcus Chen, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before a roadside bomb ended his career and his life when Sarah was 15. Her mother, Dr. Elena Chen, worked as a trauma surgeon at Walter Reed Medical Center, dealing with the aftermath of conflicts that most people only saw on the evening news. But Sarah's real education had begun much earlier, in the shadowy world of her grandfather's past.
Li Wei had been a master of ancient Chinese martial arts before immigrating to America in the 1960s.
More importantly, he had served with distinction in several classified military operations that officially never existed.
When Sarah's father deployed overseas, it was grandfather Li who took over her training.
"Size is irrelevant," he had told her during countless hours in his converted garage dojo. "Speed, precision, and intelligence defeat brute force every time."
But, more important than any technique is the ability to remain invisible until the moment you strike.
The old man had taught her things that weren't found in any military manual. How to move without making sound. How to read an opponent's intentions in the micro-expressions that crossed their face.
How to turn an enemy's strength against them with minimal effort.
Most crucially, he had taught her patience and the strategic value of being underestimated.
"Let them see weakness," Li Wei had said.
"When they believe you are harmless, they reveal their true selves.
That knowledge becomes your greatest weapon." Those lessons served Sarah well during the grueling weeks of ranger training.
While her fellow recruits focused on displays of machismo and one-upmanship, she observed and learned. She noted who lost their temper under pressure, who cut corners when they thought nobody was watching, and who would abandon their teammates to save themselves.
Tank Morrison, for instance, was all bluster and intimidation.
He performed well during strength-based exercises but cracked under psychological pressure. During a recent night navigation exercise, he had become completely lost and spent 6 hours wandering in circles before finally admitting defeat and firing his emergency flare. The incident had been quietly covered up by the training staff, but Sarah had witnessed the entire humiliating episode from her concealed observation point.
Tommy Brick Williams possessed raw power but lacked tactical thinking.
During urban warfare simulations, he consistently chose the most direct route to objectives, making himself an easy target for anyone with patience and marksmanship skills. His tendency to charge headfirst into situations had already resulted in several deaths during training scenarios.
Then, there was Marcus Snake Jefferson, whose nickname came from his slithery personality rather than any combat prowess.
He was the type who would smile to your face while planning to stab you in the back. Sarah had caught him attempting to sabotage other recruits' equipment on multiple occasions, though she had never reported the incidents. Sometimes the most valuable intelligence came from watching bad actors operate freely. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that while her fellow recruits saw her as the weakest link, she had been quietly accumulating the highest scores in virtually every category of their training. Her marksmanship scores were perfect across all weapon systems.
Her tactical assessments consistently earned top marks from instructors.
Her physical fitness scores, while not the highest in terms of raw strength, showed remarkable improvement and efficiency. But, perhaps most importantly, she had begun to notice something that none of her fellow recruits had picked up on.
They were being watched.
Not just by the obvious training staff and drill instructors, but by others. Men in civilian clothes who observed from a distance during field exercises. Personnel who didn't appear on any official roster but seemed to have unlimited access to the training facility. During her third week, Sarah had been returning from a late-night study session when she glimpsed a figure watching the barracks from the treeline. Using skills her grandfather had taught her, she had silently tracked the observer for over an hour, noting his professional equipment and practiced surveillance techniques. This wasn't some random security guard or curious local resident. This was someone with serious training conducting serious reconnaissance. The next morning, during a routine equipment inspection, Sarah noticed tiny chalk marks on her footlocker that hadn't been there the previous evening. Someone had been through her belongings with considerable skill, leaving almost no trace of their intrusion.
Almost.
Rather than report the incidents, Sarah decided to watch and wait. If someone was interested enough in the recruits to conduct covert surveillance and searches, there had to be a reason. And if they were looking for something specific among the trainees, she intended to find out what that might be. Her opportunity came during their fourth week, when the training schedule included a 3-day field exercise designed to test everything they had learned. The scenario involved a simulated enemy infiltration of a forward operating base, with the recruits divided into defending and attacking forces. Sarah found herself assigned to the defending team, tasked with preventing the attackers from retrieving a package of fake intelligence documents. The exercise began at dawn with the attacking force establishing positions in the surrounding forest. The defenders were given basic intelligence about enemy numbers and probable approach routes, then left to organize their defense. As expected, Tank Morrison immediately assumed leadership of the defending force, despite having no official authority to do so. "Okay, listen up," Tank announced to the assembled defenders. "We're going to set up a perimeter here, here, and here." He pointed to positions on a tactical map with all the strategic insight of a caveman discovering fire. "Brick, you take the north approach. Snake, you cover the east. Paper Soldier, you can watch the supply shed or something." Sarah accepted the dismissal without comment, though she noticed that Tank's defensive plan had several glaring weaknesses. Most significantly, he had completely ignored the southern approach to the base, assuming the marshy terrain would prevent any serious assault from that direction. It was exactly the kind of oversight that would get people killed in real combat. Instead of pointing out the flaw, Sarah quietly volunteered for guard duty at what Tank considered the least important position. The supply shed sat at the southern edge of the base, overlooking the supposedly impassable marsh. From Tank's perspective, it was the perfect place to stick the weakest member of the team where she couldn't cause any real problems. What Tank didn't realize was that Sarah had spent considerable time studying the topographical maps of the training area. The marsh looked treacherous from a distance, but she had identified several routes through the wetlands that would allow small groups to approach the base undetected. If the attacking force had anyone with real tactical knowledge, they would almost certainly attempt a flanking maneuver from that direction. As the day wore on, radio chatter from the other defensive positions painted a picture of increasing frustration. The attacking force seemed to be probing the perimeter without committing to any serious assault. Tank and his subordinates grew increasingly agitated as hours passed without meaningful contact. "Where the hell are they?" Tank's voice crackled over the radio for the dozenth time. "This is taking forever." Sarah maintained radio silence from her position, but she was far from bored. Using a pair of field glasses, she had been conducting methodical surveillance of the surrounding area. Just after noon, her patience was rewarded when she spotted movement in the marsh. Not the obvious splashing that amateurs would make, but the subtle displacement of vegetation that suggested someone moving with considerable skill. Through careful observation, she identified at least 4 individuals working their way through the wetlands toward the base. Their movement patterns and equipment suggested they weren't typical recruits. These people moved like professionals, with the kind of fluid coordination that came from extensive training and real-world experience. More interesting still, one of the approaching figures was carrying what appeared to be sophisticated recording equipment. Not the standard gear issued to training exercises, but professional surveillance technology. Sarah found herself wondering if this was part of the official exercise, or something else entirely. As the afternoon progressed, the attacking force drew closer to Sarah's position. She could have easily alerted Tank and the other defenders, ending the flanking attempt before it began. Instead, she decided to let events play out. If these were indeed outside observers conducting some kind of evaluation, revealing their presence too early might compromise whatever they were trying to accomplish. Besides, Sarah was curious to see exactly how skilled these infiltrators really were. Her grandfather had always taught her that the best way to measure your own abilities was against worthy opponents. The first attacker emerged from the marsh just as the sun began to set. He moved with impressive stealth, clearly believing himself unobserved as he approached the supply shed. Sarah remained perfectly still in her concealed position, watching as he conducted a careful reconnaissance of her supposed location. The man was older than the typical recruit, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of extensive field experience. His equipment was top quality, and his movement patterns suggested military training well beyond basic level. Most tellingly, he wore no identification tags or unit insignia that would connect him to any official training program. Sarah waited until he had committed to his approach, then made her move. Using skills her grandfather had drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice, she flowed out of her hiding spot like water, completely silent and invisible until the moment she struck. The man never knew what hit him. One second he was advancing on what he believed to be an empty position, the next he was face down in the dirt with Sarah's knee pressed into his spine and her training knife at his throat. "Don't move," she whispered in his ear. "Don't speak. Don't even breathe too loudly." The man's professionalism was evident in how he immediately went limp, offering no resistance. He understood that he had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by someone he had completely underestimated. But the exercise was far from over. Sarah could hear the other 3 members of the infiltration team moving into position around the supply shed. They would realize their point man was missing within minutes, and then things would get very interesting indeed. As she held her captured opponent motionless, Sarah found herself thinking about her grandfather's words regarding patience and the value of being underestimated. Tomorrow, she suspected, her fellow recruits might start looking at their paper soldier with very different eyes. The sound of approaching footsteps told her that moment might come sooner than expected. The second infiltrator appeared at the edge of the supply shed clearing exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds after Sarah had neutralized the first. She had been counting, using the breathing techniques her grandfather had taught her to maintain perfect calm while keeping her captive immobilized. The approaching figure moved with the same professional competence as his teammate, but Sarah could detect subtle signs of concern in his posture. He knew something was wrong. Sarah had positioned herself and her prisoner behind a stack of supply crates that offered concealment from multiple angles. The captured infiltrator remained motionless beneath her, understanding that any attempt to warn his teammates would result in immediate consequences. She pressed the training knife a fraction deeper against his neck as a reminder, eliciting the slightest nod of acknowledgement.
The second man used hand signals to communicate with positions Sarah couldn't see, indicating the presence of at least 2 more team members in the immediate area.
Military hand signals, she noted, but not standard U.S. Army. These looked more like the specialized communications used by special operations units or intelligence agencies. Growing more curious by the moment, Sarah decided to take a calculated risk. Instead of simply observing, she would actively hunt the remaining infiltrators. But, first, she needed to secure her current prisoner. Using zip ties from her gear pack, she quickly and silently bound the man's hands and feet, then stuffed a cloth gag into his mouth. The entire process took less than 30 seconds and generated virtually no sound. Her captive's eyes showed grudging respect for her efficiency. "Stay quiet, stay alive," she whispered before melting back into the shadows. Moving through the growing darkness like a ghost, Sarah began stalking the second infiltrator. He was good, she had to admit. His camouflage and concealment were nearly perfect, and his movement discipline was excellent. Unfortunately for him, nearly perfect wasn't good enough against someone who had been trained by Li Wei. Her grandfather had taught her that most people, even highly trained soldiers, move through the world with a certain rhythm. They breathed in patterns, stepped with consistent pressure, and turned their heads at predictable intervals. Once you learned to recognize these patterns, you could predict and exploit them. The second infiltrator was examining the supply shed methodically, searching for signs of his missing teammate. Sarah shadowed him for nearly 10 minutes, staying just outside his peripheral vision while learning his habits and timing. When he paused to check his watch, she knew she had found her opening. The attack came from above. Sarah had silently climbed onto the roof of the supply shed, waiting for the precise moment when her target was focused on something else. She dropped down behind him like a falling shadow, landing so softly that he didn't realize she was there until her arm snaked around his throat in a perfect sleeper hold. He tried to resist, but Sarah had positioned herself perfectly to control his balance and leverage. Within seconds, he was unconscious, and, within another minute, he was zip-tied and gagged alongside his teammate. 2 down, at least 2 to go. Sarah retrieved the unconscious man's radio and listened to the coded chatter from his remaining teammates. They were growing suspicious about the prolonged silence from their advance team. More importantly, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "Phoenix Base, this is Raven Team," came a voice through the static. "We may have a problem. Recommend switching to Enhanced Observation Protocol." Phoenix Base. Sarah had heard that designation exactly once before, in a classified briefing her father had inadvertently left on his desk during her senior year of high school. Phoenix was the code name for a joint military intelligence program that recruited and trained operators for assignments that officially didn't exist. Suddenly, the covert surveillance of their training group made perfect sense. Someone was looking for recruits with specific qualities that went beyond standard military competence. The question was whether Sarah wanted to be found. The third infiltrator revealed himself sooner than expected. Sarah was moving toward what she believed to be his last known position when she heard the distinctive click of a weapon being readied behind her. "Very impressive, soldier," came a calm voice from the darkness. "But, playtime is over. Please turn around slowly and keep your hands visible." Sarah complied, turning to face a man who was clearly the team leader. Older than the others, probably mid-40s, with the kind of scarred hands that spoke of extensive combat experience. His weapon was trained on her center mass, but his finger was alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. Professional courtesy among professionals. "You've been watching us," Sarah said quietly. "We've been watching all of you," he confirmed. "But you're the only one who noticed. What do you want?" "That's a conversation for people with much higher security clearances than either of us," the man replied. "For now, I'm curious about your background. That wasn't standard Army combat training you just demonstrated." Sarah considered her options. She could attempt to disarm him, but he was clearly experienced enough to maintain proper distance and positioning. She could try to stall until the official exercise controllers realized something was happening, but that might compromise whatever evaluation was taking place. Or she could be honest and see where the conversation led.
My grandfather taught me, she said simply. Your grandfather must have been quite remarkable. Those techniques aren't found in any Western military manual I'm familiar with. Li Wei. Immigrated from China in 1967. Served with some units that probably weren't on any official roster.
The team leader's eyebrows rose slightly.
Li Wei. The ghost of the Mekong. I'll be damned.
Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had never heard that nickname before, but something in the man's tone suggested it carried significant weight.
You knew him? Knew of him.
Your grandfather was something of a legend in certain circles.
Now I understand where you learned those skills.
The man lowered his weapon slightly. What I don't understand is why someone with your capabilities is playing the role of the helpless recruit.
Maybe I just like being underestimated.
That's a dangerous game in our line of work.
Eventually, someone notices. Before Sarah could respond, the radio on the ground crackled with Tank Morrison's voice. Paper soldier, this is actual. What's your status? We're getting reports of movement in your sector.
Sarah looked at the team leader, who nodded slightly. She picked up her own radio and responded in her normal, slightly neat voice. All quiet here, Tank. No movement, no contacts.
Maybe somebody saw a deer or something. Copy that. Stay alert. This exercise is dragging on too long.
The team leader smiled grimly.
Impressive performance. You've been hiding in plain sight this entire time.
It seemed like the smart play.
It was.
But now you need to decide if you want to keep playing small ball or step up to the major leagues.
What exactly are you offering? I'm not offering anything. I'm just here to evaluate and report.
But I will tell you this much, your current training program is just the beginning. There are opportunities for soldiers with special qualifications. Opportunities that don't officially exist. Sarah found herself thinking about her father, who had died in a war that officially never happened, fighting an enemy that officially didn't exist. She thought about her grandfather, the ghost of the Mekong, whose service record contained more redacted pages than actual text. And she thought about her mother, who spent her days patching up the casualties from conflicts that the public never heard about.
What would I need to do?
Finish this exercise.
Complete your training. Graduate in the top 5% of your class. When the time comes, you'll be contacted. By who? By someone with a much higher security clearance than either of us.
The man began backing away into the darkness.
Your grandfather taught you well, soldier. Don't waste his legacy playing games with children.
Sarah watched him disappear into the night, leaving her alone with more questions than answers. She spent the next several minutes securing the two unconscious infiltrators, then reported their capture to the exercise controllers using her radio.
Say again? Tank's voice crackled with disbelief. You captured what?
Two unknown personnel attempting to infiltrate the base through the southern marsh, Sarah repeated calmly.
They're secured and ready for pickup.
The aftermath of the exercise was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during her training.
Within minutes, the entire area was swarming with personnel who definitely weren't part of the normal training cadre. Men in dark suits arrived in black vehicles with no government plates.
The two captured infiltrators were removed so quickly and quietly that Sarah began to doubt they had ever existed. Major Catherine Walsh appeared at the supply shed within an hour, accompanied by a full colonel that Sarah didn't recognize.
Both officers looked grim as they surveyed the scene and listened to Sarah's carefully edited report of events. You're telling me that a single recruit managed to capture two trained infiltrators? The colonel asked skeptically.
Yes, sir, Sarah replied in her best military bearing. They were moving through the marsh using what appeared to be a coordinated flanking maneuver. I observed their approach and engaged them individually. Major Walsh studied Sarah with sharp, intelligent eyes.
How exactly did you engage them, soldier? Standard hand-to-hand combat techniques, ma'am.
I used stealth to achieve positional advantage, then applied appropriate force to neutralize the threats.
Appropriate force, the colonel repeated.
Both subjects were unconscious when the recovery team arrived.
They resisted, sir. Major Walsh exchanged a look with the colonel that Sarah couldn't interpret. Walk me through your movements, Chen. Show me exactly what happened.
For the next hour, Sarah provided a detailed demonstration of how she had tracked and captured the infiltrators. She was careful to downplay the more advanced techniques she had used, making them appear like lucky applications of basic training rather than the sophisticated combat skills they actually represented. But she could tell that Major Walsh wasn't buying the modest performance. The Major had the kind of sharp, analytical mind that missed very little, and she was clearly seeing through Sarah's attempt to minimize her capabilities. "Interesting technique," Major Walsh observed after Sarah finished her demonstration. "Where did you learn to apply a sleeper hold with that particular grip?"
"Basic combatives training, ma'am."
Drill Sergeant Rodriguez showed us several variations. I'm familiar with Rodriguez's curriculum.
That wasn't one of them.
Sarah maintained her neutral expression, but internally she was kicking herself for the oversight. She had used one of her grandfather's specialized techniques without thinking about it. "I may have modified it slightly based on my opponent's position, ma'am."
"Modified it," the colonel repeated. "On the fly. Against a trained operative. I got lucky, sir."
Major Walsh stepped closer to Sarah, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen.
"Private Chen, remove your jacket." "Ma'am?" "Your jacket. Remove it. Now." Sarah complied, stripping off her BDU jacket to reveal her olive drab t-shirt underneath.
Major Walsh's eyes immediately focused on Sarah's left wrist, where a series of small tattoos were visible.
But they weren't tattoos. They were scars.
Tiny, precise marks that formed a pattern along her forearm. To most observers, they would look like random injuries or possibly some kind of artistic scarification.
But Major Walsh clearly recognized what they actually represented. "Jesus Christ," the colonel breathed. "Those are kill marks." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The scars were indeed kill marks, though not from military service.
They represented the successful completion of her grandfather's most advanced training exercises. Each mark commemorated a perfect execution of a technique that, in real combat, would have resulted in an enemy's death. Her grandfather had told her the marks were a private reminder of her capabilities, something to keep her humble and focused. He had assured her that only someone with similar training would recognize their true meaning.
Apparently, Major Walsh qualified. "How many?" Major Walsh asked quietly.
Sarah considered lying, but something in the Major's tone suggested that would be a mistake.
15, ma'am. 15 confirmed kills, and you're pretending to be a washout recruit? They're not kills, ma'am. They're training achievements. Training for what? Sarah met the Major's eyes steadily. Training to stay alive, ma'am.
The colonel stepped forward, his expression a mixture of amazement and concern.
"Private Chen, I think it's time you told us the truth about your background."
Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled with Tank Morrison's voice.
"Major Walsh, this is Morrison.
We've secured the perimeter and completed our sweep.
No additional threats detected. Request permission to return to base." Major Walsh took the radio from Sarah.
"Morrison, this is Walsh.
Exercise concluded. Return all personnel to base immediately. Chen remains with me."
"Roger that, ma'am."
"What about Paper Soldier?" Sarah winced at the nickname, but Major Walsh's expression showed something that might have been amusement. "Private Chen will be joining me for a debriefing session. Carry on, Morrison."
As the other recruits began gathering their equipment and preparing to return to base, Sarah found herself facing a moment of truth. The game of hiding in plain sight was over.
Whatever came next would require a very different kind of performance.
Major Walsh pulled out a secure satellite phone and dialed a number from memory.
"Phoenix Base, this is Walsh. I need to speak with Control immediately."
She paused, listening. "Tell him I found our ghost."
Sarah heard her grandfather's nickname echo in her mind as Major Walsh ended the call and turned back to her.
The ghost of the Mekong's granddaughter was about to step out of the shadows and into a world where legends were made and forgotten in equal measure. "Private Chen," Major Walsh said formally, "you're about to learn that some family legacies are impossible to escape." The black SUV that transported Sarah from the training grounds bore no military markings or government plates. Major Walsh sat beside her in complete silence during the 2-hour drive through increasingly remote countryside, occasionally checking her secure phone for encrypted messages. Sarah noticed they passed through 3 different security checkpoints, each more sophisticated than the last. Their destination was a facility that didn't appear on any public maps. Set deep in the Virginia mountains, it looked like a corporate retreat center from the outside: modern buildings, landscaped grounds, and discreet parking areas. Only the subtle security measures gave away its true nature: motion sensors disguised as decorative lights, cameras hidden in fake rocks, and guard posts camouflaged as maintenance sheds. "Welcome to Phoenix Base," Major Walsh said as they pulled up to the main building. "Officially, this place doesn't exist. The land records show it as a private conference center owned by a shell company. The locals think it's where rich executives come to play soldier on weekends." Sarah studied the facility through the vehicle's tinted windows. "What is it really?" "A recruiting and evaluation center for operations that require special qualifications. Your grandfather spent time here, back when it was called something else." "You knew him personally?" Major Walsh's expression softened slightly. "I never had that honor. Li Wei was before my time. But his reputation shaped a lot of what we do here. Some of the training protocols we use were adapted from his methods." They were met at the main entrance by a man who introduced himself simply as Mr. Black. Sarah suspected that wasn't his real name. He was unremarkable in appearance: medium height, brown hair, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. But his eyes held the same sharp intelligence she had seen in Major Walsh, and he moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to violence. "Miss Chen," Mr. Black said formally. "Thank you for joining us. I understand you've had an interesting evening." "That's one way to put it, sir. Please, follow me. There are some people who would like to meet you." The interior of the building reinforced the corporate facade. Expensive carpet, tasteful artwork, conference rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. But Sarah noticed details that didn't belong in any normal business environment: reinforced door frames, bulletproof glass, and communication equipment that belonged in military command centers. They rode an elevator down 3 floors below ground level, emerging into a corridor that looked more like something from a government facility. Security cameras tracked their movement, and Sarah counted at least 4 different biometric scanners between the elevator and their destination. The conference room they entered contained a long table surrounded by chairs that had clearly been designed more for function than comfort. 3 people were already seated, studying files spread across the table's surface. Sarah recognized her own military personnel file among the documents, along with several others she couldn't identify. "Miss Chen, please have a seat," said the woman at the head of the table. She appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested she wasn't accustomed to being challenged. "I'm Director Morrison. No relation to Tank Morrison from your training group, I assure you." The other 2 people at the table were introduced as Dr. Richards, a military psychologist, and Colonel Hayes, whose exact role wasn't specified but who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Let's start with the obvious question," Director Morrison said, opening Sarah's file. "Why has someone with your capabilities been pretending to be an average recruit?" Sarah had spent the drive preparing for this moment, but she still felt exposed under the collective gaze of these professionals. "I was following my grandfather's advice about the strategic value of being underestimated," Li Wei's granddaughter, Dr. Richards observed, making notes on a tablet. "Fascinating genetic and environmental combination. Military family, exposure to advanced combat techniques from an early age, personal motivation stemming from father's death in classified operations. You seem to know quite a bit about my background, Doctor." "We know everything, Miss Chen," Director Morrison replied. Your grandfather's service record, your father's classified missions, your mother's security clearance, your own academic achievements before enlisting.
The question is what you plan to do with those advantages.
Colonel Hayes leaned forward.
Those marks on your wrist represent mastery of techniques that aren't taught in any official military program.
15 successful completions of what your grandfather called final exercises.
Care to elaborate?
Sarah realized there was no point in continued deception. These people had clearly done their homework, and they weren't the type to be fooled by evasion or misdirection. Grandfatherly believed that true combat training required understanding the difference between disabling an opponent and killing them. The final exercises were scenarios where a single mistake in technique or timing would have resulted in permanent injury or death to the training partner.
Training partner?
Dr. Richards looked up from his notes.
Who was willing to participate in such dangerous exercises?
Grandfatherly served as the training partner for all 15 exercises. He said that if I wasn't willing to risk his life to perfect the techniques, then I didn't deserve to learn them.
The room fell silent as the implications sank in.
Sarah could see the mix of admiration and concern in their expressions as they contemplated the level of trust and skill required for such training. Your grandfather was in his 70s when you completed those exercises, Colonel Hayes observed. The man was either completely insane or had absolute confidence in your abilities.
Both, probably, Sarah admitted.
But, he said the exercises were necessary because real combat doesn't offer second chances. If you're not willing to risk everything in training, you'll hesitate when lives depend on your actions. Director Morrison closed Sarah's file and leaned back in her chair.
Miss Chen, what do you know about Phoenix program?
Only what I've learned in the last few hours. Some kind of recruiting operation for classified missions. Phoenix identifies and develops operators for assignments that require special qualifications. The work is dangerous, often solitary, and always deniable. Operators work without official support, backup, or recognition. When things go wrong, the government disavows all knowledge of your existence. Sarah thought about her father's death in Afghanistan, how his sacrifice had been classified and forgotten by everyone except his family.
Like my father's unit.
Your father's unit was conventional special forces with classified mission parameters. What we do here is several levels beyond that. Director Morrison opened a different file. Phoenix operators work in the gray areas where traditional military and intelligence assets can't function. We handle situations that require someone who can think independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and complete missions with minimal guidance.
What kind of situations?
Colonel Hayes answered. Eliminating high-value targets who can't be reached through conventional means. Retrieving intelligence from hostile territories where official presence would cause diplomatic incidents.
Protecting assets who don't know they're being protected.
Sometimes, preventing conflicts that would otherwise require full military intervention. Dr. Richards looked up from his tablet.
The psychological profile for Phoenix operations is very specific.
High intelligence, exceptional combat skills, ability to work in isolation, and the mental flexibility to adapt to rapidly changing scenarios. Most importantly, operators must be capable of making life and death decisions without hesitation or second guessing. Your performance during the training exercise demonstrated all of those qualities, Major Walsh added. You identified the threat, developed a plan, executed it flawlessly, and adapted when circumstances changed. Most recruits would have either missed the infiltrators entirely or panicked when they realized what was happening.
Sarah considered what she was hearing.
These people were offering her the chance to follow in her grandfather's footsteps, to serve in operations that officially didn't exist. But, they were also making it clear that the work came with serious personal costs.
What happened to my grandfather after he left active service?
Director Morrison's expression grew somber. Li Wei completed 17 Phoenix missions over a period of 8 years. He was one of our most successful operators. But, the work changed him. By the end of his active period, he had become something of a ghost himself, brilliant, lethal, but isolated from normal human connections.
Is that why he insisted on teaching me? To prepare me for this? Possibly. Or maybe he wanted to ensure that if you ever found yourself in our world, you'd have the skills necessary to survive it. Dr. Richards set down his tablet and looked directly at Sarah. Miss Chen, I need to ask you a difficult question. Have you ever killed anyone? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt the weight of their collective attention as she considered her answer. No, she said finally. But, I understand what it means to be ready to kill if necessary. How can you be certain you understand that? Sarah rolled up her sleeve, exposing the scars on her wrist more fully. Because every one of these marks represents a moment when I chose not to kill my grandfather. In each exercise, there was an instant where a slight change in pressure, angle, or timing would have ended his life. I learned to recognize that moment and stop precisely at the threshold. That's not the same as crossing the threshold, Colonel Hayes observed. No, sir. But, it means I understand where the line is. And, understanding the line is the first step to being able to cross it when necessary. Director Morrison opened yet another file, this one containing photographs and mission briefings that made Sarah's blood run cold. Images of dead civilians, destroyed buildings, and international incidents that she recognized from news coverage. These are examples of what happens when Phoenix operations fail, Director Morrison said quietly. When operators hesitate, make mistakes, or simply aren't skilled enough for the assignment. People die. Sometimes a lot of people. Sarah studied the photographs, forcing herself to really see the consequences of failure in this line of work. Her grandfather had prepared her for many things, but he had never shown her images like these. On the other hand, Director Morrison continued, opening a second file, these are examples of successful Phoenix operations. The second set of photographs showed peaceful scenes, political leaders shaking hands, civilian populations going about their daily lives, international conferences proceeding smoothly. Nothing dramatic or newsworthy, just normal life continuing without interruption. The best Phoenix operations are the ones nobody ever hears about, Major Walsh explained. Crisis prevented, conflicts avoided, problems solved before they become disasters. Your grandfather participated in 7 such preventive operations, Director Morrison added. Conservative estimates suggest his work saved between 50,000 and 200,000 lives by preventing conflicts that would otherwise have spiraled out of control. Sarah felt a new understanding of her grandfather's later years, the long silences and distant looks that had puzzled her as a child. He hadn't been a broken old man haunted by war, he had been someone carrying the weight of secrets too important to share. What would you want me to do? Complete your current training program, Director Morrison replied. Graduate at the top of your class, which shouldn't be difficult given your actual capabilities. Then, report here for advanced evaluation and preparation. If you successfully complete Phoenix training, you'll be assigned to an operational team for a probationary period. And, if I decide this isn't for me? Then, you complete your military service obligation and return to civilian life. Your security clearance gets upgraded to include compartmentalized information, which means you never speak about Phoenix to anyone without proper authorization. But, otherwise, you're free to pursue whatever career interests you. Dr. Richards leaned forward. However, Miss Chen, I should point out that very few people with your background and capabilities find satisfaction in conventional careers. The skills your grandfather taught you aren't easily adaptable to civilian life. Sarah thought about her options. She could return to the regular army, serve out her obligation, and try to build a normal life. But, she suspected Dr. Richards was right, after everything her grandfather had taught her, normalcy might prove elusive. I need time to think about this. Of course, Director Morrison agreed. Take all the time you need. But, I will say this, your grandfather would be proud of what you've accomplished. More importantly, he would want you to use his gift wisely. As the meeting concluded and Sarah was escorted back to the surface, she found herself thinking about the weight of legacy. Her grandfather had spent years teaching her skills that most people couldn't imagine, preparing her for a world she was only now beginning to understand. The question was whether she was ready to step fully into that world, or if she wanted to find another path entirely. Either way, her days as the underestimated paper soldier were definitively over.
Tomorrow, she would have to decide who Sarah Chin was going to become. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the edge of a rooftop in Prague, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance while rain pelted her tactical gear. The mission briefing had been simple: prevent an arms dealer named Viktor Kozlov from completing a transaction that would put advanced weapons technology into the hands of terrorist organizations. The execution had proven considerably more complicated. Her training at Phoenix Base had been unlike anything she had experienced during her regular military service. Where Army training focused on unit tactics and conventional warfare, Phoenix preparation emphasized individual decision-making, improvisation, and operating without support. The instructors were former operators themselves, men and women who had completed missions in places that didn't officially exist. The physical training had been brutal but familiar. Sarah's grandfather had already pushed her body to its limits, so the combat conditioning and weapons training felt like refinements of existing skills rather than learning entirely new capabilities. The psychological preparation had been more challenging. Killing isn't the hard part, her instructor, a former Navy SEAL named Marcus Stone, had explained during one particularly intense session. Any competent soldier can pull a trigger or apply a combat technique. The hard part is making the decision to kill and, then, living with the consequences afterward. The training scenarios had forced Sarah to confront situations where there were no good choices, only necessary ones. Simulated hostage situations where saving one person meant sacrificing another. Intelligence operations where maintaining cover required watching innocent people suffer. Combat scenarios where hesitation meant mission failure and potential disaster. Through it all, Sarah had drawn on her grandfather's teachings about the difference between taking a life and taking a life with purpose. Li Wei had been very clear that killing was sometimes necessary, but it should never be casual or comfortable. The weight of that responsibility was what separated professionals from psychopaths. Now, crouched on a Prague rooftop with Viktor Kozlov in her crosshairs, Sarah was about to discover whether her training had truly prepared her for crossing that final threshold. The arms dealer was meeting his contact in a warehouse complex below, exchanging briefcases that contained both payment and technical specifications for weapons that could change the balance of power in several ongoing conflicts. Intelligence indicated that preventing this transaction could derail terrorist operations in 3 different countries. Sarah's original plan had been elegant in its simplicity: disable the warehouse's security systems, infiltrate the meeting location, and neutralize both participants with non-lethal methods. The weapons and intelligence could then be recovered by a cleanup team, and the entire incident would be written off as a business dispute gone wrong. But intelligence reports often failed to account for human variables. Kozlov had brought additional security, including 2 former Spetsnaz operatives who were scanning the surrounding area with professional paranoia. The buyer had arrived with his own protection detail, creating a situation where any direct assault would likely result in a firefight with multiple casualties. Worse, Sarah's surveillance had revealed that Kozlov was holding 3 civilian employees of the warehouse company as insurance against interference. Killing the arms dealer would be simple enough, but rescuing the hostages would require a much more complex approach. This was the reality of Phoenix operations that the training scenarios could only approximate. Real missions rarely proceeded according to plan, and operators had to adapt to circumstances that intelligence briefings couldn't predict. Sarah activated her secure communication system, knowing that the encrypted signal would be picked up by a satellite relay and transmitted to Phoenix Base. Control, this is Ghost Actual. Situation has evolved beyond parameters. The response came immediately through her earpiece. Copy that, Ghost. What's your assessment? Primary target is secured with hostages. Secondary complications include additional security and potential civilian casualties. Request guidance. There was a pause that lasted exactly 12 seconds. Sarah had learned during training that Phoenix Control used those pauses to consult with higher authorities who made decisions about acceptable risk levels and mission priorities. Ghost, you are authorized to proceed with any necessary measures to complete primary objective. Secondary considerations are noted but not mission critical. In other words, she was cleared to complete the mission even if it meant civilian casualties. The hostages were regrettable but acceptable losses if that's what success required. Sarah felt a cold anger settle in her stomach as she considered the implications. These were exactly the kinds of decisions her grandfather had warned her about, moments when institutional priorities conflicted with personal morality.
Control, request clarification. Are you authorizing lethal force against civilians? Negative, Ghost. We are authorizing mission completion using your best judgment regarding acceptable risk levels.
The distinction was subtle but important. Phoenix wasn't ordering her to kill innocent people, but they were making it clear that civilian casualties wouldn't prevent her from proceeding. The decision of how to balance mission success against human cost was being left to her judgment in the field. Sarah thought about her father, who had died following orders that prioritized mission success over individual survival. She thought about her grandfather, who had carried the weight of similar decisions for decades.
And she thought about the weapons technology that Kozlov was selling, which would certainly be used to kill innocent people in the future. Control, I'm modifying the mission parameters. Ghost out.
She switched off the communication system before Control could respond. Whatever happened next, it would be her responsibility alone. Moving across the rooftops like the ghost her grandfather had trained her to be, Sarah began implementing a plan that Phoenix Doctrine would probably consider needlessly complicated. Instead of eliminating the primary target and accepting collateral damage, she was going to attempt something far more difficult, rescuing the hostages and completing the mission without unnecessary casualties.
The warehouse complex consisted of 5 buildings arranged around a central courtyard.
Kozlov was conducting his meeting in the largest structure, while his security team was positioned to watch all approaches.
The hostages were being held in an adjacent building, guarded by one of the Spetsnaz operatives. Sarah's first objective was creating a distraction that would draw attention away from the hostages.
Using skills her grandfather had taught her about improvised demolitions, she rigged a small explosive charge in an electrical panel on the far side of the complex. The resulting power outage and small fire would look like an accident, but it would force security personnel to investigate. The diversion worked perfectly. Within minutes of the explosion, 2 members of Kozlov's security team were rushing toward the disturbance, leaving the hostage location lightly guarded. Sarah used the cover of darkness and confusion to infiltrate the building where the civilians were being held.
The remaining Spetsnaz operative was good, but he wasn't expecting an attack from someone trained by Li Wei.
Sarah took him down with a combination of techniques that left him unconscious but alive. The 3 warehouse employees were terrified but unharmed, and Sarah quickly explained that she was there to help them escape. "Stay low, move quietly, and follow my lead," she whispered as she led them toward a rear exit. "Don't look back, don't ask questions, and don't stop moving until you're out of the complex." Getting the civilians to safety took precious time, but Sarah considered it an essential investment. Her grandfather had always taught her that protecting innocent people was more important than completing missions efficiently. With the hostages clear, Sarah turned her attention to the primary objective. Kozlov and his buyer were still conducting their transaction, but they were now aware that something was wrong. The arms dealer was speaking rapidly into a radio, trying to re-establish contact with his missing security personnel. Sarah had originally planned to capture both men alive, but their increased alertness made that approach much more dangerous. Instead, she decided to focus on the weapons technology itself. If she could destroy or confiscate the technical specifications, the actual elimination of the individuals involved became less critical. Moving through the warehouse's ventilation system, Sarah positioned herself directly above the meeting location. Through the metal grating, she could see Kozlov examining the contents of a briefcase while his buyer waited impatiently nearby. The technical specifications were contained in both digital and hard copy format. Sarah could see a laptop computer displaying weapon schematics alongside printed documents that appeared to contain manufacturing details. A small explosive charge placed precisely could destroy both sets of information while leaving the participants stunned but alive. But, as Sarah prepared to implement this plan, she overheard a conversation that changed everything.
"The Prague transaction is just the beginning," Kozlov was saying in accented English.
"Once we prove the technology works, I have buyers lined up in 6 countries.
The Syrian contract alone will move enough weapons to outfit an entire terrorist army." The buyer, a thin man with nervous eyes, nodded enthusiastically. My organization is particularly interested in the portable chemical delivery systems. We have several population centers identified for field testing. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the implications became clear. This wasn't just an arms deal, it was the beginning of a much larger operation that would result in mass casualties. Allowing these men to leave Prague would mean condemning thousands of innocent people to death. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the greatest kindness is preventing someone from becoming a monster. Sarah made her decision. The first shot took Kozlov in the center of his forehead, killing him instantly. The buyer had just enough time to look up in confusion before the second shot ended his involvement in any future atrocities. Both men collapsed without understanding what had happened to them. Moving quickly, Sarah dropped into the warehouse and secured both the digital and physical copies of the weapons specifications. She also recovered Kozlov's contact lists and financial records, which would provide Phoenix analysts with intelligence about other aspects of his network. The entire engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes. By the time the remaining security personnel realized what was happening, Sarah was already extracting through a pre-planned escape route that took her across several rooftops and into the Prague metro system. 18 hours later, she was back at Phoenix Base, delivering her after-action report to Director Morrison and the same evaluation panel that had recruited her 6 months earlier. You modified mission parameters without authorization, Director Morrison observed after reviewing Sarah's written report. Yes, ma'am. You prioritized civilian rescue over operational efficiency. Yes, ma'am. And you made the decision to eliminate both targets based on intelligence gathered during the operation rather than following the original plan. Yes, ma'am. Director Morrison closed the file and studied Sarah with the same sharp intelligence that had characterized their first meeting. Dr. Richards, what's your assessment? The psychologist consulted his notes. Operationally, the mission was a complete success. Both primary targets eliminated, weapons technology secured, valuable intelligence recovered, and 0 civilian casualties. From a psychological standpoint, the operator demonstrated excellent judgment under pressure and maintained clear moral boundaries while accomplishing mission objectives. Colonel Hayes leaned forward. Chen, do you have any regrets about how the operation proceeded? Sarah considered the question carefully. She thought about Kozlov and his buyer, who would never again sell weapons to terrorists. She thought about the warehouse employees, who had returned safely to their families. And she thought about the thousands of potential victims who would never know how close they had come to chemical weapon attacks. No, sir. I believe I made the right decisions given the circumstances. Even though you killed 2 people? Yes, sir. They were planning mass murder. Stopping them was worth the cost. Major Walsh, who had been silent throughout the debriefing, finally spoke up. How do you feel about the actual act of killing? Sarah thought about the moment when she had pulled the trigger, the weight of the decision and the finality of its consequences. She remembered her grandfather's teaching about the difference between taking a life and taking a life with purpose. Heavy, ma'am. But not wrong. Director Morrison nodded slowly. That's the response of someone who understands the responsibility of this work. Congratulations, Ms. Chen. You've successfully completed your probationary period. What happens now? Now you become a full Phoenix operative. You'll be assigned more complex missions, given greater operational autonomy, and tasked with problems that require your specific combination of skills and judgment. As Sarah left the debriefing room, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors leading to the elevator. The young woman looking back at her still appeared unremarkable, average height, quiet demeanor, the kind of person who would blend into any crowd. But her eyes held something that hadn't been there 6 months earlier, the weight of knowledge about what she was capable of doing when necessary. Her fellow trainees from Fort Braxton would probably still see her as the paper soldier if they encountered her today. They would never understand that sometimes the most dangerous warriors were the ones who look least threatening. Her grandfather had taught her well about the strategic value of being underestimated.
But Tank Morrison, Brick Williams, Snake Jefferson, and the rest would never have to face the kinds of choices Sarah had confronted in Prague. They would serve in conventional units, following orders and fighting enemies who wore uniforms and followed rules of engagement. Sarah's war would be fought in shadows, against opponents who hid among civilians and threatened innocent people with weapons that conventional military forces couldn't stop. It was a lonely, dangerous path that offered no recognition and little thanks. But it was also necessary work, and Sarah had discovered that she was uniquely suited for it. Her grandfather's legacy lived on through her hands and her choices, protecting people who would never know her name. 3 weeks later, Sarah received her next mission briefing. Another arms dealer, another city, another chance to prevent atrocity through precision application of violence. She studied the intelligence reports with the same careful attention she had brought to her grandfather's teachings, preparing to once again step into the shadows where necessary work was done. The paper soldier was gone forever, replaced by something far more dangerous, a weapon disguised as an ordinary person, pointed at the darkness that threatened innocent lives. And, in that transformation, Li Wei's granddaughter had finally found her true calling.